throw new error. And I'm back to green. Okay. Any questions on that? So that's Jasmine in a nutshell. There's I put some resources in here for you. So here's that's the book I talked about, the Kent Beck book. I highly recommend reading it. If you ever want to interview at Pivotal, that's pretty much the study guide for our first interview. This is another great book, so Working Effective with Unit Tests, written by a guy named Jay Fields, wrote RSpec for anybody of Ruby knows Ruby. This is where I got the idea of your test should read like stories. Great book, uses a lot of examples, like starts with some pretty janky tests, and then refactors them to where you're like, whoa, I actually can see what's going on in there. And the tests he used are test suites that I've seen those tests. They all work, perfectly valid working test suites. They're just really hard to read and change. There's the Jasmine documentation, Jasmine on GitHub, the demo GitHub repo. And this whole idea, I talked about this a little bit of this whole idea of code katas. There's a whole website here that gives you problems, very small ones, that you can use this process to solve to hone your test driving skills. So the way I get good at writing tests is I wrote a lot of tests, and I studied with people, and I paired with people who are really good at writing tests. It's the only really way to get good. You just have to do this. And the reason people don't write tests is because they're slow. Well, you invest some time outside of work, and they get faster, and then you don't want to not write tests. You always want to write tests. Because I actually write I write code faster now with tests than I do without tests. Because of this whole idea of like, does the test, all these like ideas in my head, like does the code work? Did I get it right? If I change this, is it broken? Like that kind of stuff all goes through my head. But you have to get to a point where you've got some skill to do that. Yes, sir?
I do test-driven development, but I do with Python.
Yeah?
And what I'm finding is that it's really good for testing your models or your instance methods or class methods or static methods, things like that. But when my business logic gets really complicated, it doesn't help me with the logic errors at all. Do you have any strategy for dealing with that situation?
Yes. And I would say that because testing doesn't help you with your logic errors, your design is flawed in your application. So typically when I find out my business logic is really complicated, I'll break out an object just to do business logic. So like in Rails, we went through this whole phase of fat controllers, skinny models. Controllers were really hard to test. So we threw all the logic into the models, and then we have skinny controllers and fat models, and now we have obese models, and models are really hard to test. So what you want to do is you want to pull that logic out so you can write tests around just the logic. And it depends on the situation. I'd have to see the exact code. But my big philosophy is the smaller box I can put my logic in, the easier it is to wrap tests around it. There are multiple levels of testing. So what I showed you here is a concept called unit testing, which I have one object, maybe one collaborator object, and I test that thing. There's this idea of integration testing where I test multiple things. And if you're familiar with Rails or Django, anything that touches a database is technically an integration test because I'm going across boundaries. Then you have acceptance tests, which are bigger. Like there are multiple layers of testing. That's a whole, probably another hour-long talk in of its own. But Kent Beck talks about it a little bit. The Working Effective with Unit Tests talks a little bit about it. Jay Fields has got a really interesting idea of solitary unit tests and collaborative unit tests. Some interesting ideas floating around the community. So yeah, it's hard to say without seeing an example, but I would lend to think that if your code is hard to test, that there's too much going on in that one piece of code.
Yeah, what I started doing is I've kind of got like 3 layers. Like in my views, which is similar to the Rails controller, I'll have a view, which basically is responsible for the logic for rendering the page.
Yep.
And then I'll have maybe a second layer, which would be some type of method or function that defines a certain piece of business functionality. But then once I get into that, everything is very discrete little functions that do one and one thing. Because if I don't limit it, then I'll have like 4 or 5 layers deep with these methods. And the name you look So
Mhm.
I tried to, I got like 3 layers, and I know the third layer is going to be nothing but discrete functions. and
Cool.
methods and whatnot.
Yeah, cool. Any other questions? Yes,
Why did you choose Jasmine as your testing framework?
because Vijay asked me to do a talk on Jasmine. So Jasmine is used by the Angular core team. There's Mocha, there's Chai, there's like, you know, one of my biggest concerns with the JavaScript community is it's like the not invented here syndrome. Like, I don't like that framework. I didn't write it, so I'm going to write my own. They're all good. They're all just really, so everything I taught you will apply to Jasmine, Mocha, RSpec, JUnit. Like the testing theory, it's now just learning syntax and best practices. So I could have very easily done this in Mocha. It would have looked pretty similar, but not identical. So it just depends on what the flavor of the day is. It might be what somebody else has chosen. You might wander in a code base that's using Mocha, and you can't walk in and be like, hey, I'm going to rewrite this all in Jasmine. There's 100,000 tests. So you're going to have to learn that. So getting good at learning those testing frameworks while still applying the basic understanding of what TDD is kind of important. Anyone other question? I like Mocha as a language, as a testing framework.
In terms of integrating this into an already existing project, like what I see, from what I can tell from back here, you're essentially running the same code in the command line to just keep testing
Yep.
standalone.
Yeah.
But if you wanted to integrate this with a build process, or maybe be separate from this with a build process, like, with my example, I'm working with React, so I got to transpile off JSX. It's like abstracted JavaScript. So do I just keep it separate from the build process, or do I pipe the build process into the testing after I bring it back to regular JS?
Yes. So we do a thing called continuous integration at Pivotal where we're always running our tests. At some point, you'd want to pipe it in probably after the transpilation, after the JSX transformation.
Okay.
I don't know how you'd test Jasmine and JS. I mean, really, testing React is really, it's a view layer. So do you really need to test your view layer?
They have this like test utils.
Yeah, like React's got something built in, I think.
Okay.
So you want to test as much as you can. You want to
I sort of want to see what this is all about.
get it integrated. Yeah. I've never written Jasmine tests against a React app, so I can't help you there. But I'm assuming the folks at Facebook are testing because Kent Beck actually works at Facebook. So they've got something built in there, I think.
They're using Jest.
Are they using Jest? Okay. Yeah. So this is the other thing is there's like the community's moving so fast that like the patterns, getting out in front of the patterns can be hard. Like how do I test React? I have no idea. I can tell you how to test Angular because I've done this process with Angular.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was just, because it is an abstraction. I mean, they have some add-on where you can call simulate method and it simulates a view layer, I guess, and then that's how
Yeah.
you test it. But I just don't know the order of
Yeah.
how we put Jasmine in there.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if it's compatible.
Yeah.
Like again, I've shown you a very small, like I have player object. How do I test player object in classes? Testing Angular with this stuff gets a little trickier. Like our Angular test suite was interesting, especially when using Angular futures. Because if you're using Angular futures, you actually have to tick the Angular clock in our test. That took us like 4 hours to figure out. We're like, why are the tests not passing? And you're like, oh, I have to tick the clock. And in some obscure blog post written by the Angular team somewhere. That being said, if you're testing, if the framework you're using, that team uses a specific framework, I would incent you to stay with that framework. Because if they're using it, there's probably some blog posts on the engineering blog of like how this works. Yeah.
They do say that they use Jest, but that it's compatible. Jest looks a lot like Jasmine.
Yeah.
In terms of the argument and then function.
It's just syntax. It's really just syntax to describe something that I want to run. Somebody on the mailing list asked about BDD versus TDD. Who asked that question? I think they're actually identical. It's testing first.
Shouldn't expect any difference.
Yeah, some people will say that BDD uses the Gherkin syntax, the given when then syntax. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
haven't seen much difference
No.
For Jasmine is BDD.
Yeah, I struggle with the behavior vision development. Well, if I'm doing TDD and JUnit, am I not testing behavior? Yeah. And this is the other thing I've been struggling with lately is it's kind of like marketing in software now. Everybody wants to bring out their new philosophy so they can sell consulting hours and like get a name for themselves. Being a consultant, I can say that. So yeah, like you saw it's the same thing, and it's the end. Like, what is your goal? Your goal is to make sure your stuff doesn't break, that you can read the tests. Like I've seen JUnit tests that read better than Cucumber tests, and that's JUnit's not BDD, it's TDD technically. So yeah, it's tricky. It's the end of the day, it's readability and communication. Yeah.
New question, but what do the tests look like if they're not as verbose? Like you talked about how some members of the programming community said that even having the longer statement in the test was considered to be cheating. It was kind of like you seem to be writing as little as possible for it to be.
Yeah, it's like let's do this. Let's get this back on the screen. So the question was, like, if people consider this to be documentation, you have to pass Jasmine a first argument. It is simply a global function. You just do that. If you're writing RSpec, there's actually RSpec syntax that allows you to eliminate that string. That I think is worse than not having it, but it's kind of one of those things. The team's got to decide. Play with it a little bit. It's agile, like. You got to toss it around and see what makes sense for you. Does that help? Yeah. I kind of like that. I use it as a tool to make me think about what is my setup, what is my action, what is my assertion, and what is my teardown. Because simply by the fact of thinking through that, I can already have the test in my, kind of visualized in my head. I've sat with a lot of beginners that can't write that, and then they can't write the test. Because you have you conceptually have no idea what you're testing. I've sat with a lot of senior developers that can't do that. And they're like, what are you testing? Like, I don't know. I'm just going to throw a bunch of code at the screen and hope it works. That scares me. And again, that's my philosophy that most of what I do is sit and think, and a little bit of it is actually putting ASCII characters on the screen to tell the computer to take what I'm thinking and actually do what I'm thinking. Yes?
What strategy would you recommend to start implementing TDD in an already existing code base?
There is a great book written probably 15 years ago called Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. It's, again, also written in Java. The philosophy that Michael takes is the problem with retrofitting tests to existing code is the evergreen problem. Do I know that thing actually fails? The other one is, as I told you, TDD is a design exercise. I can carve off these little pieces that I can wrap tests around. If you've never been forced to carve off those little things, now you have to wrap tests around a much bigger thing because there are no seams. So the test ends up being much bigger, much harder to set up because you've got this big glob of code that does 12,000 things. You need to test every one of those things. So in the book, there are concepts, creating seams, breaking out objects. You have to be very careful, though, of changing existing code without a test suite because you don't know if you break anything. So it is a kind of minefield sometimes. What you want to do is you want to identify where can I put, what's the smallest thing I can put tests around, write those tests. We call them characterization tests. They actually are really great for helping you understand what the code does. So part of learning what code does is actually you reading the code and understanding it. So if you can start putting tests around that, and then typically what I do is I just comment out, I write a test that I think should fail at some point, and then I comment out the line of code that I think should make it fail, and I see if the test fails. If the test fails, now I understand what the code is doing because I've found the line of code that causes some external behavior that I can test. And then I uncomment and make sure the test goes green. That's one of them. There are others. There are a lot of them. And it's just, wrapping tests around it, making sure they fail at some point, and then carefully unwinding the ball of twine to make sure that you can get, and they're hard. It's a hard problem. If anyone ever comes to you with a consulting gig of I want you to wrap tests around this 6-year-old legacy app, charge them a lot of money and multiply your estimates by 10. Because it will show them how much, it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. It's really painful.
I have a question.
Yes?
I've heard other speakers say that the skill of unit testing
Mm.
I'm just curious to hear what you have to say about that.
What did they tell you why?
So he talked about it. It was actually a speaker called Roy Boschwell.
Mm.
He wrote
Not familiar.
Art of Unit Testing.
Oh, cool. He wrote a book, so he probably knows what he's
He
talking
said
about.
he thinks some other authors have tackled both at the same time and have confused their readers.
Yeah, it's, again, like there's marketing going on here. I would have to ask him why. I think just like any other skill, some of us are better at some portions than others. I really like the Kent Beck book. I look at that, like I go back to that once every couple of months just to refine. Like I think that process works really well for me. I would be interested to read, is it called The Art of Unit Testing?
Yeah.
I'd be interested to read that book and like see if it resonates with me. It may not, but it may resonate with you. And again, if it gets you to the goal of high quality software that's easy to write tests around and easy to change, then I don't care what we call it at this point. You know, my goals are software I can change on a drop of a hat, because the only thing constant in software is change. And whatever kind of tools I need to use to to do that is what I'm going to learn. So I don't know. It'd be an interesting discussion. We probably agree on some things and disagree on others, and he might change my mind on a couple, and I may change his mind on a couple. But find something that resonates with you, practice the heck out of it, get good at it, and then start making decisions. So that's the other thing. Like as beginners to this, you have no idea how to make a valid assumption as to what you're learning is good or bad. You can't make those like gut decisions. So read the Kent Beck book, practice it, learn that, get really good at it, and then you can start being like, oh, when I tweak this little part of my flow, this is what changes. So it's like lean software. It's like lean product on your software process. So like you get good at something, you're like, I'm good at this. Now I'm going to start experimenting to see if I can get better. So one of the reasons I love teaching beginners is because they're always challenging me on my flow. And I can constantly refine my flow based on things that they teach me. I learned about a year and a half ago about git add-p. How many people use Git? How many people know about git add-p? Try it. Git add if you've got a bunch of files that are changed, do a git add-p and see if it changes your workflow. It revolutionized the way my workflow. So what it'll allow you to do is add the hunks interactively. So it'll go through each file and show you each diff and ask you a question of yes or no, do you want to add this to the stage? So if you've got like 16 files changed, maybe you're working on 2 stories and you want to break that up into 2 clean commits, it allows you to do that interactively. It revolutionized the way my Git workflow. And I mean, for like 5 years, I had no idea it existed. And that was just because I paired with somebody and talked to somebody about it. But I knew Git. I mean, I had a workflow and I knew what I wanted to do, and I was very efficient at it, and that just changed it. So that's like kind of this whole story. As a beginner, you just got to get good at something, and focus on getting good at one practice, and then start to make opinions about it and see if it fits. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Question. You talked about the 4 stages or the 4 principles of a test.
4 parts.
4 parts.
4 parts of a
Would you
test.
mind going back to one of the tests and showing
Yeah.
how they...
Yeah, that's a great question. So, all right, I'm going to let you identify them. So I would like for this test, I would like someone to identify the setup. Yeah, it's above it. So this is where these nested describe blocks get a little tricky because the story's split up. So for this test right here, this is set up and this is set up. So I'm setting up 2 objects and those are my setups. What's the second step? Do something, exercise the object. Everybody's got their own thing. So that is the exercise portion. Third part. Assertions. Here are my assertions. What's the first one? Tear down. Where's my tear down?
You don't have one.
I don't have any in this test. Anybody write Rails in here? What's the tear down in a Rails model test? It's the database cleanup. It's rolling back of a transaction so the database stays clean, which you don't see. It's implicit tear down. Yeah, so in Rails, when you write a model test, which is stuff that interacts with a database, when the test starts, Rails starts a database transaction. When the test ends, it rolls the transaction back so the database stays clean. That is actually an implicit teardown. So that would like database cleanups. Anytime you need to reset some state back to an original state. These unit tests rarely have state, but an integration test might have state that you need to roll back. That would be the teardown. There's actually also implicit teardown that these objects actually will get garbage collected at some point. So there's a garbage collection teardown, but you don't necessarily always see it in the tests. So, yes, sir.
Can you talk about logging the results for your test when you're looking at project? I mean, just workflow consideration.
Logging. For what purpose? Why would you want to log them?
Stable versions, etc., things like that purpose.
Oh, so once a build goes green, how do I tag that stuff?
Yeah. Do you have that built into your build process? Or?
Yeah, that's part of my CI pipeline. I might have a stage. Like my first stage might be run all my tests, my unit tests. The second one might be write all my integration tests, because I don't want to run my integration tests if my unit tests are broken, because if my unit tests are broken, my integration tests are broken.
Yeah, I guess I was going to more ask, like, do you ever log those results just for that?
Oh no, I just want a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Okay.
I don't care if
Stopping with their
if they're broken, then there's no sense in going on. If they're green, awesome. I'll eventually figure out what they're doing later. Some people might. We just have never had the need for that. It's usually like a thumbs up, thumbs down, and continue on with however long, whatever the build process does. I don't know if Jasmine gives you the ability to output the results into a text file. You could probably just pipe the results into a text file and then save it as whatever CI server you're using, publish it as some sort of build artifact. Yes?
So how does Jasmine handle something like future events? Like, say I do an Ajax request.
Yep.
How do I test? How do I set that up in the test?
There's a library called Jasmine Ajax that allows you to do that very easily. So it plugs in, your setup is actually telling these, like the fake Ajax call, what it's going to return you. So in traditional tests, when I want to isolate myself from a third-party service, I insert some sort of mock layer, some stub, like this fake layer. Jasmine Ajax gives you the ability to do that. So you say, when I call this service, hand me back a 200 with this JSON. And then you could assert on the JSON that comes back. There's all kinds of ways to do it. But there's a library that helps you do that. Yes?
You kind of touched on it. Does Jasmine have something like mock objects?
Yes, Jasmine does have mock objects. And I will have to look up that documentation. All right, let's use 2.3. Yeah, so you actually, in Jasmine, they're called spies. So subtle difference between spies and mocks. But yeah, it has that notion of being able to create a fake thing and be able to assert that I call an object, a method on that fake thing. Like if you're doing business, like a business logic, you've got a bunch of objects. There's an orchestration layer that's calling a bunch of objects. You would use a spy. Yes?
Did you say there was a website I thought you put up there, code data casts or something?
Code katas. Code kata casts.
Sorry.
Yep. And that's in the, it's at one of the links in the back end of this presentation. So they do Fizzbuzz in JavaScript. Everybody know Fizzbuzz? If it's a multiple of 3, you return Fizz. If it's a multiple of 5, you return Buzz. If it's a multiple of both, you return Fizzbuzz. And if it's not a multiple of any of those, just return the number. Very common programming, like first round interview. They do Fizzbuzz. And they live code it so you can actually see what they're doing. Any other questions? So there's a lot here. Thank you for listening. If you're overwhelmed, that's okay. Like, there's a lot here. If you have questions, I'll hang out for a little bit. We can chat. If not, you can get a hold of me on Twitter. That's probably the best way to get a hold of me these days. You just post questions. Yeah, and thank you for coming. Oh, I have 5 of these things to give out. So you asked a lot of good questions. You had a couple of good answers. Gentleman in the checkered shirt there, I'm going to just chuck this, hope I don't put somebody's eye out. Who else? You had a couple of good questions. And then you had a couple of good questions. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming.